Good morning, everyone. I'm Cornelius Tulloch, interdisciplinary artist and architect, and really I'm excited here to kind of share my own journey and just kind of what are my current obsessions as an artist and what inspires me continuously to do the storytelling that happens in my practice. As Sophie kind of spoke a lot, coming from an architecturally trained background, a lot of my work really looks at space, but through the phenomenological, so looking at the things that are intangible about space, social architecture, how we exist within it, how does both the built and natural environment hold stories and histories within them. So a lot of my practice really tries to materialize some of these immaterial things into my works, and really has kind of allowed me to build a practice that spatially has impact, but also visually channeling and kind of tracing these lineages that expand from the US South, the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, and looking at these kind of convergence of cultures and this kind of creolization of culture and how it kind of mixes and melds to create new forms of craft and visual language. And so that really kind of now is how I'm able to describe my work. But beginning, I was just kind of really fascinated with space and how we exist and show up in space. And a lot of that, I think, was heavily impacted by my upbringing in Miami, but also in conversation with Jamaica. So my dad's side of the family is from Jamaica, and I would spend, coming to school and stuff in Miami. But when it was summertime, my dad was like, you have to go out yard. So we went to Jamaica and we would stay with our grandmother, and it would just be such a different shift in space, and I felt how I kind of existed in space. And really just kind of also there I learned a kind of deep connection to the landscape, to what was around us. And I think realizing slowly as I kind of got older, I was like, oh, what are these kind of shifts in language and body movement in space? And then it really, I think, set in for me kind of that interest. Maybe when I got to college and I was no longer in Miami, but found myself in Ithaca, New York. I don't know if you've ever been to Ithaca. Very different than Miami. Not just the weather, but culturally, landscape, everything was so different. And that really made me kind of start realizing what was important to me spatially. What were the stories that I wanted to bring with me into this space, especially at a school of architecture like Cornell, where you're studying very modern architecture, contemporary, and the specific lineage of architects, where it was great in learning all of that, but many stories did not reflect my story in the space of architecture. And so I really was like, well, how do I begin to investigate architecture that reflects the Caribbean, architecture that reflects Miami, architecture that reflects the Black American South, and how do I kind of bring that to, one, the scale, but also add to this kind of canon within architecture that has this same level of research, because it's although I wasn't seeing it in the books and the research, it's I knew these things existed. I knew that there was a certain lineage in thing because I lived it. I experienced it in these spaces. And so for me, as I kind of began, and it was so funny even being there in studying architecture, because my friends would always be like, what are you doing here? You're such an artist. Why are you torturing yourself, working up until 5 a.m., drawing, drafting? But I think that kind of rigor that you do within the architecture training really kind of teaches you to design and think at such large scales and to understand systems. And so a lot of that comes back into my practice now in my studio and how I'm kind of framing certain conversations, but it really expanded me. And I think within that research, it really was architecture that was giving me the kind of meat of my research and understanding space and looking at these different qualities. But it was super interesting kind of crafting what architecture was to me while at Cornell, but really kind of also realizing that there was a certain gap in understanding between even me and my professors. And I will never forget in my thesis when I was kind of building this thing around Miami architecture, I kind of focused on Little Haiti and how Little Haiti, a lot of the architecture that we see there, not only comes from Haiti itself in the Caribbean, but traces all the way back to West Africa. So in ironwork, in fences and things that we see, seeing that this history wasn't only a thing that kind of existed here, but it came from somewhere, and these things that we may overlook spatially, whether it's kind of the Sankofa symbol that you see in ironwork fences or other things. It's like all these things have a whole line that they're coming from and things that we're understanding. So for me, that was like eye-opening. And then really within that kind of project, that's actually where the project that I'm currently now working on, Porch Passages, which I'll get into later, kind of started and spurred from that thesis that started in 2020, and really looking at kind of what happens in vacant lots and spaces once we show that they're occupied and lived in, and looking at, as particularly that time, especially as well, where it was like gentrification expanded, where it was like any lot that went vacant, it's like, okay, this is now someone's excuse to say, well, I'm gonna make it better. I'm gonna do this, but it's like, no, there were lives and stories within these spaces that existed before someone couldn't pay the rent. So it's like, how do we begin to talk to these histories that happen within space? And I kind of looked at that as a way of like, all right, I want to do installations in these kind of vacant spaces and bring them to life through kind of community programming. But the challenges within themselves were permits, other things, but kind of in this building and working through it, I really found a space where I feel like at Miami's center is art, whether that's through dance, music, food, any other way, and saw that like through vacant lots, amplifying them through art, through culture, through craft, gave them a different life that was hard for someone to then push over or pull through or kind of build something on top of, and really started noticing just kind of how much culture was a builder for innovation in the neighborhoods that we have around us in South Florida, and really kind of being an impetus for how I saw my art kind of aiding in telling these stories and kind of impacting these spaces. So really kind of going straight out of school, I had been working for a couple firms, and really great firms. I got my dream firm. It was great. I was working in New York. And then there was a certain point where I was just like, all right, this is cool. This is what I thought I wanted, but I'm kind of bored. And I was like, there's no way I'm living the rest of my life sitting in this desk, like, you know, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, you got that job. I'm like, yeah, but I'm about to leave the job. But like, and so that was just like such a real experience where I was just like, you know, architecture is great, but I felt like the voice and stake and interest that I had in architecture didn't exist in the firm in that way. And then kind of seeing some of my other mentors and stuff who also came from Cornell, like Amanda Williams, who are architects, but also came in to develop their own kind of artistic practice, I saw how much kind of range their voice was able to amplify, where you're still able to have conversations about architecture and impact the kind of practice and ideas and thoughts and theories that impact architecture, but as an artist. And so really kind of started directing my practice towards refining kind of my portfolio as an artist, and really looking at just really ways to gather community. And I think that was part of what allowed my work to kind of resonate in Miami really well and kind of build such a strong kind of presence, was that I wasn't worried about just, oh, making a piece. It was like, what do people experience when they come to this show? What do people experience when they come into this space? So a lot of my early like solo shows and stuff weren't just like, oh, gallery, she, we're gonna talk and laugh. Like, we had parties. We were like blocking out the street, drinks, everything. And really that's where I saw the power of this kind of social architecture at play in the gallery space, redefining new spaces, empty lots, different things as a way to really kind of gather community and have conversations about how do we tell stories, how do we archive them, how do we pass them down to the next generation. And I found that there also were so many stories in Miami and across the Caribbean that really have been hidden in a way in seeing them. And so a lot of that was expanded when I was actually a resident at ARI before, artistic director in 2022. And I was really, really amazed when I found the work of the Florida Highwaymen, which were a group of painters, African-American painters who kind of worked as a collective and taught each other how to paint, but they used painting as a way to kind of build a path out of the Jim Crow South and kind of selling work out of their cars. That's why they were called the Highwaymen, and getting a chance to look into their lineage, but see, okay, how can I as an artist use my work in an innovative way to talk about legacy, but also to speak to the landscape of Florida. and accessing different stories. And so then in that time there, I found the story of the Saltwater Railroad, which was essentially a journey south that enslaved people would take to liberate themselves. And essentially it was the Underground Railroad, but coming south through Everglades, through Biscayne Bay, and out to the Caribbean. And so I was like, wow, there's so many of these stories that are built here, and seeing that like deserve so much more presence. So how can I, as an artist, use my work to begin to almost archive and also imagine some of these stories that don't have pictures to show, that don't have the same thing, that are only held by oral tradition, while also mixing in my everyday experience growing up in Miami, experiences from the Caribbean. And so I started to really kind of refine that, and that's when I kind of went into a section of like photography, beginning to kind of do light ephemeral installations, which was also something where it was like, oh yeah, in architecture, I could do these things because there was a budget. There was someone else's money that we were using to put our vision and deliver a product. Although maybe that kind of limited some of the artisticness, it was like they had a budget, it got done. Whereas as an artist, it's like, how do I build this big thing with no budget or limited budget? And so from there, I began to kind of find these different ways to create ephemeral installations, a lot using fabric and creating textile structures that depicted images and things. And really that allowed me to create these kind of larger scale works that were impactful, but with kind of very limited materials and things, and also to kind of create a presence. And so realizing that, yes, I can still have this spatial impact, I can still have this level of storytelling, and still indent myself in all this research and skills that I had. And really it was kind of, I'd say for me, this kind of shift then of like, all right, I'm now working at this huge installation scale, but also working on like 2D works, and really started to think like, how do I build a path that allows me to merge the two, to really allow my work to also feel expressive and feel like it captured fully what I wanted to say? Because now people were like, well, are you an architect? Are you a painter? Like, which one is it? And I was like, well, it's all of the above. You know, it's all how I'm really trying to craft this kind of practice that is like interdisciplinary, but also multimedia, and really kind of just centering the storytelling, no matter what medium, what thing that is. And so for me, it kind of became this moment of refinement, and it really helped me through residencies as a big kind of turning point. Once I started doing more residencies and using those as kind of moments for continued education, where I would try new materials, experiment with different things, and really just kind of allow the work to find its own voice and lane, and not be focused on like, oh, what is the final outcome, but more really giving myself to the process of building. And so it actually kind of started when I did a residency at Anderson Ranch, and that was through Ulight's Home and Away program. But they ended up putting me in the sculpture studio, and I was like, I don't do sculpture. What's that? Like, what do you mean? I'm like, installation, yes. Sculpture, I don't know if that's the same thing to me, but because it's like, even with architecture, I'm not thinking object, you know, I'm thinking in this other way. And then on the other side, I'm like, you can call me a painter, but I don't know about a sculptor, you know, I don't want to claim anything that I'm not really making. But being in there, it actually was the perfect fit, because I started thinking, how do I scale down these more monumental ideas into smaller pieces, and that can also communicate at that same level. And I started just literally started by kind of working within their scraps and taking kind of wood scraps and materials and found objects, and began building and collaging. And it really started making me think a lot about how materials hold memory. How do these kind of objects or hard materials that we build structures and things out of come from other parts? So kind of started then taking pieces from other people's projects that they didn't need, and they're like, here you go. Like, people started handing me all their random scraps, and really began to kind of build and see like, okay, what are these other aspects and things, as I'm talking about these different histories and these layered things, how can the actual material and making of the work reflect that? And so I started kind of experimenting a little bit more with these kind of wood relief collages that kind of merged these kind of two spaces. And then that kind of literally, I did that in February. and ended up doing another residency in April through DVCAI, which is ran by Rosie Gordon-Wallace. And that residency sent me to Suriname. And there, going from Anderson Ranch, which is in Aspen in the mountains, it's snowy, literally to like 2 months later, I'm out in the middle of the Amazon of Paramaribo, Suriname. And that's also something that I think for me made me realize how important travel was to the storytelling and actually meeting people. And then it really became about interviewing people, finding these stories, look at the ways that they're crafting, but also seeing how they're crafting based on the materials, based on the location that they were in. So that was something that I really took from Suriname, was like the people there. I got to go to a maroon village and stay with these wood carvers. And that was the wildest 4 days of my life. And it started by me just being like, hey, I'm interested in going. I want to learn more about maroons, because I learned about maroons, growing up in Jamaica. We have Queen Nanny and all these kind of stories that we grow up, but it's kind of like, it's real, but it's just it's a story. It's not something that I can tangible. So I'm like, if I can go to an actual maroon village and experience these people who kind of found liberation in the forest and built this whole community, what would that do for my practice? And really that just kind of like started with them being like, all right, we'll set it up. And then here I am, I'm like, all right, I'm going to this maroon village. Don't really know much. They're kind of like, just relax. Like, you Americans always want all the information. Like, it'll be chill, don't worry. And I'm like, okay, you're sending me out into the Amazon and you're giving me no details. But I was like, you know what, trust it, like, go. And so they're like, all right, tomorrow you're gonna leave at 6 a.m., like, be ready. We're gonna drop you off to the taxi driver. So then I'm like, all right, I get ready. I go. Then the taxi driver, we stop, I get into his car, then we ride for 3 hours out into I don't even know where. And then we get to this boat dock and he's like, all right, you're gonna go sit in that chair over there. And in about an hour, someone will come and tap you and they're gonna bring you. And I'm like, who? He's like, don't worry, they'll know who you are. Like, you stand out, like, you're good. Just sit over there. So I literally sit, and this guy in this like blue shirt and a red cap comes over. He's like, let's go. I get up, and then we ride another 2 hours by these kind of small boat that you kind of sit in one line, like almost like a larger canoe, and like, it's motorized. And so we go out for 2 hours, and it is just kind of this like super beautiful journey into the Amazon, and seeing kind of how remote they were, but also these kind of just massive trees and things. And so I get there to the maroon village, and literally they kind of drop me off at a dock, and I'm like, all right, no one gave me the next steps. What do I do now? So I literally end up trying to communicate with these little kids there, but they don't know English. I don't know their language. And we're just laughing at this point because we're like, all right. So I'm like, okay, let me go walk around a little bit, figure out. Mind you, it's like 5 p.m. already. And so the people who were supposed to meet me, I don't know where they are. They're like not there. But essentially, they go and get one of the elders from the village, and he comes and sets me up in a cabin. So all that worked out. But that experience there was so incredible, because then I kind of spent the day with the wood carvers the next day. And they just kind of told me about the history and the different patterns. And then I kind of got to see such a different also approach to architecture and the way that they were building, where every building was wood carved but had specific patterns, techniques, symbols on it that also was another expression of language and storytelling within it. Different buildings were for different age groups and different genders and spaces within the family. And so kind of seeing that made me think a lot more about kind of how can architecture and space have this level of storytelling and cultural significance, and in what way do we begin to apply that to our cities and spaces that are drastically changing in these ways. And so with that, I kind of also really kind of took away some of the craft. In like the biggest takeaway, they had this idea of tembe or craft that they kind of produced, where oftentimes men and women would have different tasks, and the men would often go to either find lumber or wood or hunt. And so they would go off in their rafts, go into the river, and while they were away, they would carve different wooden combs and things as gifts. And then the women would kind of weave different kind of textiles and things, but when they came back, they exchanged it, because the idea of tembe was that craft was intrinsic to who we are as human beings, and that exchange was just a sign of love. And it kind of made me think of like, how can my practice, even as a contemporary artist who's existing in some of these commercial spaces and stuff, still keep that kind of essence of craft and what my creativity as this expression of love, of community. And so once I got back from there, I really started looking at what materials am I using a lot more keenly, and a lot of that switched the way that I was painting. So I went from just kind of painting traditional portraits and things and turned them into kind of these mixed media surfaces where I began to kind of use photo transfers and really break down just all the rules that I learned. Because yes, I was into architecture, but it's like my career, my kind of track in art started in Miami at Dash, which is the magnet school, design and architecture senior high. So it's like, for most of my life at that point, I had been learning art from the age of 14 and told all of that up until I was like 23. And so then from there, it's like, how do I now begin to craft my own voice that feels like it is mine, that I have an entitlement to this storytelling, and how can I really play around with materials in a way that reflected Miami, that reflected the Caribbean, that reflected these stories, instead of just using canvas as canvas. And so within that, I started to treat like canvases as these kind of spatial surfaces, and began layering stories and layering the materials in the same way that I would say if you're painting a wall or creating a kind of weathered wall material in the background. And my practice got way more involved. And that's when like painting for me became really an exercise, because I scaled up one. So I'm no longer working kind of at this scale. I'm like lifting and stretching and moving, but that really allowed me to kind of add to the storytelling and add to the materiality that I was working with. And that kind of really shifted the way that the portraits, but also the way that the body showed up in my work, and also made me start thinking more about like, how do we kind of merge the bodies with these landscapes that they're a part of. So a lot of my work has this kind of lush flora in research that really looks into looking at what plants are native to this space, what plants aren't native, and then talking about that story in this exchange between the Caribbean and the US South. Public art is a lot of work, and it really kind of pushes you outside of your comfort zone and makes you kind of think a lot about a lot of different factors. But it's like, yeah, the audience is so much bigger when your work is existing in this space, and how does it actually connect to the community? And I think that was the biggest thing for me, of like, how do I move beyond just creating dialogue as an artist, but to create action in the community, to create moments where people are actually engaged in the conversation, or creating a artwork that may add some other realm. And so with the project Porch Passages, I'm creating these ironwork sculptures that also become sites for programming, whatever that may be that people choose in the kind of realm, but really allowing our community to still have third spaces to exist, to gather, to be. And this kind of really has sustained something that allows my practice and work to exist beyond the gallery and actually create impact, and I think take up space in Miami. And so as an artist who was born and raised kind of in South Florida, it's important that our stories and spaces still have us in it, especially as the urban fabric changes so much with like new development and all these things. And I find it's kind of this weird machine where like, yes, new development provides opportunities for artists to do public art and these things, but it's like, as artists, how can we also advocate so that the community actually has something impactful within that? Yes, it'll be beautiful. Yes, it'll bring people, but how do we actually kind of create these kind of really impactful projects? And so I think a lot of my practice has been kind of navigating this space. And so now after, what has it been? Almost 4 years working, Porch Passages will finally kind of debut at the end of this month on November 29th at the African Heritage Cultural Arts Center. So I'm excited. So I'm excited to kind of invite you all to that. It'll be from 5 to 8 p.m., but really kind of has shifted the way that I see my practice. Yes, in the studio, outside of the studio, and really seeing myself, yes, as artist and architect, but really as someone who's trying to move culture, who's trying to move the ways that we engage within our city, within how we're building the future of these spaces, and really holding space for stories that really center the types of stories and identities and intersections that exist within Miami and South Florida as a whole. But yeah, thank you. Thank you.
If you have any questions for Cornelius, we will take like some of them just to let you be. And after we want to take a group photo with everyone, so don't leave now. So we'll take a group photo. So if you have any question for Cornelius? No question? So, okay, I love that you can explore so many different mediums, you're so experiential, and you have a lot of fun. How do you approach, and because you do so many different photography, painting, installation, how do you approach a new piece, a new concept, and what decides what medium you're going to do?
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of a slow burner. Like, I think people would be shocked how far an idea starts from where it actually kind of turns into something. So say even like the recent body work, which you were also a part of at Armory. So Tayina is one of my subjects in the painting. Although I had developed that kind of piece later, but the research and even getting to that, I think, was just a culmination. Like I look at my practice as something where even some of the images from that work I had taken 3 years ago, but just now getting to it. So for me, I'm kind of a serial sketchbook person. Like I'm always jotting down ideas and things, and writing actually helps me a lot kind of think through my work and what I want to do. So sometimes I'll write down ideas of ways that I want to work with materials or certain things, and it won't be for 2 or 3 years, or honestly the right project may come up and then I actually can enact it. But I always have seen that what has worked best, because I'm someone who, like, I'm always thinking at the biggest level, the biggest idea. Like, for right now, I'm like, what happens if I ever do the Venice Biennale? Like, you know, I'm already like, what happens this day? But it's like, I'm really trying to think, but I found that the best way to get to these large ideas is through iteration and adaptation. So even for this project, Porch Passages, like, yes, the final kind of public art install and thing is now being debuted, but that got tested in 4 other shows prior to that. So like with Locust Projects, I tested some ideas of the porch as this storytelling space. How do I work with this kind of language? And I think I would say, honestly, before Suriname, I was very timid to try new stuff because I was like, I know I can paint. Yeah. And I can do that, like, you know, it's like second nature, like getting into it, or photography. And so it really made me be like, yes, you can do these things, but like, how much more expansive could it be if you tried these other materials? And I think that opened me up to also like playing around with materiality a lot more and being a lot less scared. I don't know what it was in my head where it was like, you were taught how to do a painting, and like if you break away from that, it's no longer a painting, or it's no longer as pure as just that. But I really had to kind of check myself and be like, why do you think these things? Like, where are these thoughts coming from? Like, how do I begin? And it was inserted on when some artists are like, yeah, it's a very different way of thinking, because in there, it was like seeing the artist's work who, whether they went to Amsterdam to learn or whatever. So coming from Western schools versus artists who learn and were just working from Suriname, showed me was like, oh wow, you really can just do whatever you want and make work that also reflects this culture, these stories, with the actual material choices that you're making, rather than just kind of putting those stories onto another canvas or other thing. And so that made me really kind of rethink my own process and what materials. And I think I will say I definitely have explored way more, I think, in the past 2.5 years than prior before. You want to